The blaze of ruddy light which surrounded his bed on the very stroke of one all but paralyzed him where he lay. The source, he came to believe, was from the adjoining room, and as the idea took full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. A cheerful voice bade him to enter as his hand fell upon the lock, but he merely turned the doorknob and peered into the next room. It was his own room, but transformed by living green so that it looked a perfect grove. Evergreen swags hung with crisp clusters of holly and their bright gleaming berries trailed strands of ivy to the floor, their shiny leaves reflecting back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. A fine fire blazed merrily in the fireplace, a fine fire indeed. That dull petrification of a hearth had never known such a blaze to grow roaring up the chimney in Scrooge's time, or Marley's either. A veritable feast was heaped in abundance, but less as for show than for superfluity. And an easy state upon this throne of food sat a jolly giant glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in a shape not unlike the horn of plenty. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly, noting with relief the crown of holly that this spirit wore upon its brow, and the belt of ivy loosely girdling its green mantle. An empty rusting scabbard hung from this belt, and its feet were bare. "I am the ghost of Christmas presents," said the spirit. "You have never seen the like of me before?" "Never," Scrooge made answer. "I see that you have not the mark of my elder brothers born in these later years. Do you fear me?" Scrooge looked upon the spirit, and made no answer, for he had been taught to fear but one thing in his parsimony, and yet he looked upon this experience with deep trepidation. "Touch my robe," directed the spirit. Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, red berries, ivy, feast, fire, ruddy glow, all vanished instantly. They stood in the streets on Christmas morning, as the people made a rough music with the scraping the snow off the pavements and tops of houses. The houses were black with soot, and the snow had been plowed into dirty furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed into intricate channels. The scene should have been gloomy, yet there was an air of cheerfulness and holiday about the movements. "Bless this day," they seemed to say, "for in the dark and cold of winter, joy has entered the world." As Scrooge and the spirit walked along the road, Scrooge saw the day as he never had. Some few of the shops were yet open, the poulterers' and fruiterers' shops awaiting belated purchase of forgotten items. The abundance of the spirit's entry was on display on the street, as had never made itself evident to Scrooge before, but not in a flashy, boastful way. The profusion of food seemed to wait in hope for the feast as much as their eventual purchasers. Soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and shining faces. At the same time, there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he sprinkled their dinners with incense from his torch. This alarmed Scrooge until he noticed that the incense more closely resembled a puff of dust than of pyrite glitter, and soon angry words were calmed. "Is there a particular flavor in that which you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "It is my own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." At this, Scrooge looked thoughtful, and wondered what other flavors might be applied by more inimical creatures. The spirit led Scrooge to the very threshold of a door that belonged to Scrooge's clerk. Upon that threshold the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Scrooge watched the true joy present in the family of his poor clerk, whose oldest son was proud to wear his father's collar, whose wife wore a dress twice turned, but brave in ribbons, which make a goodly show for sixpence, and whose youngest son, thin and pale, wore braces on his legs, but a smile on his face. His gaze lingered on little Timothy, who bore his sufferings with such patience, and a touch of true pity entered his heart. After the feast, and such a meagre portion to be termed a feast, the ghost directed him to take hold of his robe again, and they flew over the wild sea to a rocky isle scarce big enough to hold the lighthouse perched upon it. In an interior room, protected from the wild storm that raged around, 2 men sat by the light of a lantern, carefully working with their hands, carving, tying, repairing, and creating. At the elder's prompting, the young man recited as though from a catechism. The ivy protects and binds and holds. The holly defends, the best weapon against the foe. But beware the mistletoe, which sets not its feet upon the ground. It latches on and will suck you dry. Scrooge started, for this was the very training he had undergone, though in far more urban surroundings. The elder man, gruff and weathered by the heavy seas, pulled a rough book from the shelf and tilted it so that the light would fall upon its pages. "And how shall the glitter be sorted from the gold?" The younger man, scarce more than a boy, took a breath. "The conspicuous display of wealth that does but little good. The ones around that fall prey to that consumption. The show, the flash, the longing for acclaim, all of these are the glitter." "And the gold?" prompted the elder, brusquely, but not unkindly. Again the breath, the closed eyes, and this time a verse. "Do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly." Scrooge swallowed, and knew this for as stern a rebuke as the ghost would give. Marley had never taught such, and had discouraged charity entire as a sign of the enemy. To hear such teachings, to know the fight went on to more than one front, and one in which he was severely lacking, it was a hard realization. As their journey went on through what seemed to be many days compressed into one, Scrooge noticed the spirit seeming to grow old. As they looked upon a children's 12th night party, he inquired if all spirits lived so short a time. "My time upon this earth shall end quite soon. It departs upon the very stroke of midnight." "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. "But I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw for all the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From within its robe it brought forth 2 children, meagre, ragged, and scowling. One seemed to be a girl, thin and wretched, with lank hair and shriveled features. She stared unthinkingly before herself, and did not seem to notice anything about her. The other was a boy, who glared with a pugnacious look around himself. He turned but slightly, and Scrooge noticed a creature, a veritable imp of a thing, clinging to his back. The fiendish thing seemed to be all bone and sinew, and was a sickly yellowed green, and its eyes were dull white, like 2 mistletoe berries in its wizened skull. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are the children of humanity," said the spirit, looking down. "The boy is ignorance, and the girl is lack." "And that creature?" ventured Scrooge. "Do you not recognize it, then? It is the follower of the ones you fight, and their source of strength. Its name is envy, and it grows larger every year. Scrooge warily watched the demon thing as it clung and whispered in the boy's ear. "I should think it would go to the girl," he said at last. "You still have much to learn," replied the spirit with failing breath. "The boy has doom written upon his brow if matters change not." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. "Are you, then, the spirit of Christmas yet to come?" quavered Scrooge. The spectre inclined his head to him, then turned with a sweep of his arm, as if inviting Scrooge to follow. The fog hung thick and low. Scrooge did not know whether this were the shape of the Christmases to come, or if it were the artifact of this strange method by which the spirit could show events which had yet to pass. In that vague semi-darkness, the ghost indicated a group of businessmen deep in the Exchange, where Scrooge spent much of his own time. "Old Scratch has got his own at last," one said in an offhand manner. "So I heard," replied a portly gentleman. "Gasped his last in his bed alone. No one should have known, were he not absent from his counting-house. I heard his clerk was the one to discover him." "Humph," grunted a third. "Be a poor funeral. Should we attend?" "I'll make one if there is food to be had," said the stout one. "It's not as though he left us anything." "And me a particular friend of his," said the first with heavy irony. "After all, he greeted me most every day on the street. I should like to see anyone else say they knew him better." And with a gust of bitter laughter, the three men went their respective ways.